You know what?
Hey, go ahead.
Is this okay?
I just want to set up my lesson. You set my
Scott wasn't around last year when I was here. Not when I was here.
Just off and on, sometimes.
Dr. Lauren Esposito. She received her master's degree and PhD from City University of New York and American Museum of Natural History. She is specialized in arachnids of the Caribbean. She has visited nearly all the Caribbean islands in order to describe and collect the great biodiversity of this area, including Saba. Let's hear a big applause for Dr. Lauren Esposito.
I've been doing research in the Caribbean, on Caribbean arachnids for about 12 years now. My area of specialization is really scorpions. I'm a scorpion biologist. But over the last 5 years, actually over the last 3 years, there's been this huge initiative in the Caribbean to look at arachnid biodiversity in general. So we've been through a National Science Foundation grant from the US, we've been doing a huge survey of arachnids. So at this point we've visited almost every island, with a couple of exceptions. We haven't been to Jamaica, which will be this November, and we haven't been to the Cayman Islands, but I'll save that for the end so maybe I can finally get a vacation. But one of the things one of the reasons that we decided to do this project, that we proposed to do this project, was because the Caribbean is in a biodiversity hotspot. It's a biodiversity hotspot for both marine animals and terrestrial or land-dwelling animals. And that includes arachnids. And arachnids are usually a mega-diverse group in many areas of the world, and this includes the Caribbean. So as we've been systematically going island to island and doing these massive collection efforts, we've started to discover that the Caribbean probably has way more biodiversity in terms of arachnids than we ever imagined. And these are just a few examples. Actually, all of the spiders that are here on this slide are jumping spiders, and these are all jumping spiders from the Caribbean. And you can see there's really an incredible diversity. There's everything from jumping spiders that mimic ants. So like this guy right here is a perfect ant mimic for an ant that lives in the same environment. To jumping spiders that are like extremely colorful. So I don't know, you can't see too well here, but this guy he has a bright blue face and a really green abdomen. And so this is just one tiny group of spiders in all of the arachnids. So it just gives you a sense of just quite the diversity that we have going on. So this is obviously the Caribbean region. We're somewhere over here, right? And one of the things that, so I came here in February for the second time in my life, but for the first time looking for more than just scorpions. All my previous trips to Caribbean islands had been primarily to look for scorpions. And one of the things that I noticed right away was that it seemed like Saba had more diversity of spiders than the surrounding islands. And so I started to think about that. Why would Saba? It's not bigger than the surrounding islands. Doesn't necessarily seem to immediately have more types of habitat than the surrounding islands. Statia has wet forest and dry forest. So what were the reasons? And as I started to think about it more and more, I came across a paper that somebody had published a couple of years ago. So it turns out that some guys came here, I think in 2010, and they weren't arachnologists, but they were working as part of a biodiversity survey of Saba. And they did a really preliminary survey of arachnids. So as non-experts, they came in and did the best that they could, which was quite remarkable. And they found that in fact they confirmed what I was feeling, that Saba does have more species of spiders in the surrounding area. And in fact, the title of their paper was something like, and it extreme biodiversity hotspot. So within the biodiversity hotspot of the Caribbean, you have Saba that in fact has even more biodiversity. And so the reasons for that are a couple. I think first of all, Saba is very steep. So even though it's a small island, it has more types of habitat than an island of the same size that's flatter. So because we have this real extreme elevation. The second thing is because Saba is not connected to any of the surrounding islands by land in history. So for example, St. Martin, St. Bart's, and Anguilla were all connected during periods when the sea level was lower. And so those islands were a single island, a much larger island. Whereas Saba, on the other hand, its nearest land neighbor is connected by the Saba Bank to the US Virgin Islands. So that's another reason that Saba has incredible diversity. The nearest land neighbor is the US Virgin Islands, which has a completely different set of spiders than its nearest geographic neighbor, which is St. Martin or St. Bart's or Statia. So, here's just sort of an overview of arachnids, so you can get a sense of what I mean when I talk about arachnids. The arachnids are actually like an extremely diverse group. I think there's about 100,000 described species of arachnid, which far outnumbers all the vertebrate species combined. And so here's just a few examples. Some of them are really familiar with, others probably you've never seen or imagined that such a creature existed. So here's pycnogonids, which are sea spiders. So these are really the only totally marine version. Oh, actually, we have Pseudoscorpions, which are horseshoe crabs. So there's two things that are still living in the water. Everything else is on land. Pycnogonids are like these quite gigantic, monster-looking things that live at the bottom of deep trenches. We also have spiders, of course. Everybody's probably seen a spider in their life, I would hope. We have mites. So mites are a huge amount of the diversity of arachnids. In our study right now, we're not looking at mites so much because they're actually quite difficult to study. And mites even have their own society. They're separate from all the rest of the arachnologists. So we let the mite people take over. Then there's scorpions, which are really my area of expertise. I've been specializing on Caribbean, in particular, scorpions for quite a number of years now. And then we have a few other things that are related. This isn't an arachnid at all. I don't even know what that's doing there. Somebody else made this slide. We also have some fossils. There's quite a number of fossil arachnids. So for example, scorpions, their fossil relatives were something called a eurypterid, which if any of you have ever lived in New York, happens to be the state fossil of New York State. They were these giant sea, like sort of top predators of the sea in the Cambrian. And they were like 1 meter to 2 meters long, and they looked almost identical to modern day scorpions. They had a long tail at the end, they had sort of big claws up front. And so we can see like scorpions, they really haven't changed much over time, which is one of the reasons that I became so intrigued in them. Let's see. So, well, here's some more arachnids. So these guys here, they're called harvestmen. You can see them here. They're distributed throughout the world. Some people call them daddy long-legs, although that's confusing because there's daddy long-leg spiders and then daddy long-leg harvestmen. So I usually just stick with harvestmen. There's these little tiny things up here at the top called pseudoscorpions, and you can see why they're similar to a scorpion, but they don't have the tail. And these guys are really microscopic. They're usually under 2 millimeters. They live under sort of decaying vegetation and that sort of thing. And there's ticks, which are part of the mite family. If you've ever encountered them, it probably wasn't pleasant. Then there's these guys up here, which are pretty weird. They're actually quite difficult to find in the New World. They're called sometimes they're called sun spiders, but the scientific name is Solophugi. And if you go to like Asia or to the Middle East, they're actually quite abundant, and they get to be quite large. I've seen pictures of them where they're like the length of somebody's forearm. And the reason they're called sun spiders or sometimes wind spiders is because they run extremely fast. And these guys up here and these guys right here, which are another close relative called Tailless whip scorpions, are the only two arachnids that are lacking venom structures. So all these other guys have some sort of structure that produces venom or some other noxious substance. So scorpions have a stinger at the end of their tail that produces venom. Spiders produce venom in their fangs. Harvestmen produce some sort of venom in their fangs as well, although not all of them do. Pseudoscorpions actually produce venom in their claws, which is a unique adaptation and only found in Pseudoscorpions. And then ticks have some sort of anticoagulant. It's not a true venom, but it prevents blood from clotting. Aside from venom, which doesn't unite all arachnids, but it unites many, all arachnids have 8 legs, so that's how you can tell an arachnid straight away. They have 8 legs. In some cases, they've been modified into sort of like feeling arms that aren't used for walking, but are instead used for feeling around. And this is particularly true in arachnids that are specialized for caves. So in the case of these guys right here, which are called Tailless Scorpions, their first pair of legs is like these extremely elongate feelers that are, if you look at them under a scanning electron microscope, which is a type of microscope that allows you to look at really, really tiny structures, you can see they're just completely covered in like pitted hairs and all sorts of sensory organs. So this is really like their dominant way of sensing their environment. They're adapted mostly for caves, although you can find them on the base of big trees in the tropics. So the other thing that's really common to almost all arachnids is that they take care of their young. So almost all arachnids have some sort of young care. In the case of spiders, it's usually fairly fleeting. They lay an egg sac in their web often, and then the female will usually guard it until the babies emerge, and then they'll go their separate ways. In the case of other things like scorpions, tailless whip spiders, harvestmen, pseudoscorpions, and these guys on here, which are called vinegaroons because they spray vinegar. They all actually exhibit maternal care for long periods of time. So they'll lay eggs, and the eggs will be either attached to them sort of on a structure, like a pouch underneath their body, or in the case of scorpions, they give birth to live young. And then the mother will care for the young for an extended period, which is usually what we call instars. So since all arachnids have an exoskeleton, a skeleton on the outside of their body, in order to grow, they have to molt that skeleton. And so each time the individual molts, that's another instar. So, you know, you can sort of consider that like years of life in human life. So scorpions and amblypygids and vinegaroons will care for their babies for usually 2 or 3 instars until the babies are developed enough to really hunt for themselves and go out on their own. So spiders are the most diverse group of arachnids outside of mites. Mites are extremely diverse. They're pests on all sorts of things, and they've sort of like radiated in ways that we can't even imagine. But in terms of the non-mite arachnids, spiders are by far the most diverse. There's more than 42,000 discovered species. And the estimate of the discovered versus unknown species is about 10%. So the idea is that we only know about 10% of the total diversity. And one of the ways that we figure that out is when we go to do these big surveys in new places, we do sort of systematic collecting. So we'll do one certain thing for a certain amount of time in a certain amount of space. So, for example, one of the ways that we collect is something called bush beating, which means you just take a sheet that looks like a kite, and you hold it underneath the trees, and you whack the trees with a stick and knock everything out of them. And so you do bush beating for an hour, and at the end of that hour, you say you have 30 individuals that are all the same species, and 30 individuals that are in a second species, and another 40 that are a third species. But then you have maybe 10 individuals that you only caught one single one of them. So for those species, you caught one individual. So we have a good idea that we're missing a large amount of the species. So we're getting the things that are the most common, but the things that are really rare, we're not finding them very much. And so that's one of the ways that we assess how good of a job we're doing when we do biodiversity surveys. So we use these systematic methods, and then we basically count how good of a job we're doing, how many individuals are we finding in each species.
So are you saying a tree has 150 spiders in it on average?
It could have more than 150 spiders. I mean, it depends on how big the tree is. And yeah, feel free, to pipe in, like, if anybody has questions as I'm talking. I love hearing questions and something's not clear. So here's just like a tiny sliver sampling of the diversity of spiders that we see up here. Is something called a Araneae, and you can see right here, this tiny little thing is not actually a baby, it's actually a parasite in the web. So spiders actually parasitize themselves. They also eat other spiders. There's spiders that specialize on eating other spiders. And so this guy is actually living in the web of this is a black widow spider, which many people are familiar with. It's living in the web of the black widow, and it's actually eating any bits of food that she drops. This guy down here is a relative of a tarantula. It's not a true tarantula, but tarantulas are the most primitive spiders, and they're usually the biggest, and often the ones that people are the most scared of, although their venom is probably one of the least potent. This guy right here that's peeking his little head out is a trapdoor spider, and so trapdoor spiders we find all over. They build sort of like circular corks that they plug up their burrows with. And then on top is a jumping spider, which I think are by far the cutest spiders. Sometimes they have the little furry ears, and one of the other things about spiders, and not just spiders, but many arachnid groups, is besides being really good moms, they're also like dedicate massive amounts of time to courting. So this guy up here, he's pretty bright colored. You can't see his whole body, but one of the reasons he's so brightly colored is because he's trying to attract females. And so in the case of jumping spiders, if you've never seen a video of a jumping spider courting a female, you should go on YouTube and check it out, because it's really cool. They actually do this extremely long, sometimes it's like lasts for like 10 hours. And the male jumps around the female and then has to do dances and drumming in a certain order, so they drum on the substrate using both their feet, and they also have like sort of a rasping thing that's sort of like a washboard and stick that they rub on the floor, and they have to do it all in exactly the perfect timing. And not only do they have to make like this orchestra, they have to do things with their body at the same time. So as they're doing a drum roll, at the crescendo of the drum roll, they'll pop out their feet and wave them around in the air. And their feet have special like stripes and stuff on them to attract the female's attention. So I would say that by far jumping spiders and many other arachnids rival like sort of the best bird displays that anybody's ever seen. They're just really tiny, so it's hard to see. So here's a little bit about some of the groups. This is a Piliones. These are harvestmen. Up in the Americas, in North America, we see them looking like this a lot of times, which is why they're called daddy longlegs. So this is just like a pile of them. In the tropics, we see a lot like this. These are cosmetids. It's pretty common. As I walk up the trail from sort of like windward side up to the eco lodge where I'm staying, if I walk up there at night, the rocks are completely covered with these cosmetics. There's just like hundreds of them. And these guys, they're completely harmless, but they're kind of scary looking. These I think, outside of scorpions, I can't say that scorpions are my favorite because that's what I studied, but if I could, I would say that these guys are my favorite, Amblypygi. And so they have also really complex courtship rituals, but also the males. You can see right here, this is their jaws right here. And the males, in some cases, have really elongate jaws. And the way that they battle over territory and over females is they don't actually fight, they just open their jaws and walk up to each other. And whoever's jaws are the biggest, the other one leaves.
Size matters.
These guys are pseudoscorpions. They're really cute. They also have really long-term parental care, which is fantastic. Sometimes you'll see a mom and a dad and like a whole little brood of babies when you peel back some bark of a tree. But one of the coolest things about them is if they get scared, they actually back up as fast as they can. So if you go up to the front of them and poke them, they sort of like walk backwards like that. This is my favorite. This is scorpions, and so this is actually a species from Curacao. And so there's scorpions on every single island in the Caribbean. Most islands have 2 species. Bigger islands like Hispaniola or Cuba or Jamaica or Puerto Rico have many, considerably more than that, but all the small islands have at least 2 species. If you've never seen a scorpion before, this is what they look like. All scorpions can be recognized right away by the fact that they have a tail and claws up front. We know of about 2,100 species, but that number increases at a rate of about 20 per year. So there's about 20 new species of scorpion described every year. As a group, they're about 400 million years old. So scorpions have been living on land for about 400 million years. And in that period of time, they've basically gone unchanged. They've shrunk a little when they first made the move to terrestrial life. They were a bit bigger, but they've shrunk considerably since then. And this number, this 400 million year old number, makes them the first terrestrial arthropod. So the first thing living on land that had an exoskeleton. I'm not totally sure about worms. I think that there's certainly some worms that had been living on land prior to scorpions, but they were by far the first terrestrial arthropods. So they were here before any insects, before any spiders, before any land crabs, before anything really. And in that time, they really haven't changed much. There has been one big dividing change. So if you take all this 2,100 species and you want to make like a rough cut down the middle, there's two basic body plans. There's this body plan up here, where they have really big claws and usually a sort of puny tail when compared to the size of the claws. And then there's this group down here, which has usually a tail that's at least as wide as the size of the claws. And so if you just think about that, I think it becomes quite clear right away that these guys up here are using their claws primarily for prey, for killing their prey. And these guys down here are primarily using the venom that's contained in the stinger at the end of their tail. And so these ones down here tend to be the ones that are more dangerous to humans. Certainly not all of them are, but in the cases where scorpions are dangerous to humans, it comes from these guys down here. Here in Saba, we have one representative from each group. So one that looks a bit like this, although really tiny, no bigger than my thumbnail. And one that looks more or less like this, that's probably about the length of my thumb. So neither one of them is very big. Both of them are actually quite harmless, although I generally don't recommend like having anything stab their stinger into you. It doesn't feel good, but nothing would happen should it inject some venom. So this is primarily what scorpions make venom for eating all sorts of nocturnal insects. They'll eat just about anything that they can subdue. So if they come across something that's usually smaller than them, they'll eat it. They'll eat each other. They'll eat other species of scorpions. They'll eat spiders. They'll eat tiny geckos. They'll eat small mouse. They'll eat just about anything. They're predators. They're hungry almost all the time. Almost all scorpions, with the exception of maybe 2 species, are nocturnal. So they're sleeping during the day. They come out at night to hunt. And I saw somebody's giving a talk later this week about about animals that use starlight to navigate, and scorpions can generally be included in this group. So if you guys anybody's ever used a GPS, like either on your cell phone or a real GPS device, I don't know if you know how it functions, but the way it works is it uses something called triangulation. And triangulation, basically, you take your device and the device looks up into the sky or to the cellular towers and it finds a minimum of 3 of them. And then it calculates your location as being in the center of those 3 points. And so scorpions actually do the same thing with the stars. So not all scorpion species do this, but scorpions that live in very open sort of sand dune deserts certainly use triangulation to navigate. And these scorpions are also really interesting because they make these really complex burrows. So not all scorpions burrow, but many do. And some of these burrows are like several meters deep and consist of like corkscrews and false entrances and like cavities where they brood their babies and many other sort of features of their burrows. So they really invest like a large amount of time and effort into constructing these burrows. So if they're going to go out and forage at night, it's really important that they can find this burrow that they spent maybe a significant proportion of their life constructing. And so what they do actually is they look up into the stars and they use the relative position of the stars to determine which direction they're walking in. So if this scorpion is trying to figure out how to get back to his burrow that's under this rock, he uses the relative position of the stars. So he's not necessarily looking at the same stars every night, but he's looking at the relative position, so how the stars turn as he turns.
How do the investigators, scientists, figure out that scorpions do that?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So one of the first clues was that in these scorpions that are living in these sand dunes, so the sand dunes are like for the most part featureless. There's no trees or anything to get your bearings. And so one of the things that they realized right away was that all these scorpions that are living in sand dunes have the arrangement of their eyes in an unusual way. And none of them are related to each other necessarily. They're living in sand dunes in completely different areas of the globe. But all of them have this weird thing where they all have a median set of eyes, so a set of eyes in the middle of their head, and then 2 pairs up here in the front. So they have some right here, and then one set right here. And these ones, they can't really go anywhere. They're right in the front of the head, right on the edge of sort of their head shell, if you want to call it that. It's called the carapace. But these guys right here, they move backwards in the sand dune dwelling ones. And so somebody started thinking like, why would all scorpions living on sand dunes have eyes pushed back on their head? And so some people did some experiments, actually, some celestial experiments where I think they poked holes in paper and acclimated scorpions to a terrarium that had some sort of star navigation pattern in it, and then cleaned the terrarium out, bleached it so they couldn't smell any pheromones or anything, and then put them back in there and tried to see if they would move toward the old position of their old burrow or in just some random pattern. And the conclusion was that in fact it seems like they're using this, in the absence of any other cues about where their burrow should be, they're using starlight. These sort of lava tube caves in Mexico, and in some cases they're 600 meters below sea level. So all the way from the Andes and the Alps to 600 meters below sea level. As I mentioned before, all scorpions have venom, and they produce venom in two glands that are at the final segment of their tail, called the sting. And these venom glands produce a vast array of venom. They don't just make one kind of venom. Like 400-million-year-old animals wouldn't be satisfied with a single type of venom. No way. In some cases, they produce like 250, 300 different types of venom in a single scorpion. And so these venoms are all really specific. They attack specific molecules in specific nervous systems of specific animals. So scorpions make venoms that are specific to mammals. They make venoms that are specific to crustaceans. They make venoms that are specific to insects. And within those types of animals that the venoms are designated for, they're attacking like molecules within the nervous system. And so that's one of the reasons that in some cases, scorpions are potentially dangerous to us. But on the other side of that, it's one of the reasons why scorpions are potentially a benefit to us. So in the case of the scorpions, so for my PhD, I studied this group of scorpions called the bark scorpions. And in Mexico, there's as many as 2,000 fatalities a year from scorpion envenomation from this group. And so I started becoming really curious about why in Mexico are they so venomous, but in other regions where they live, like in the Caribbean, like in Saba, they're really not. And so I started thinking about that, and I decided to look in more depth about the venoms. So what I did was I took some scorpions and I expressed their venom glands. So I milked the venom out, which made them produce more venom. So they turned on all the genes in their body that make venom. And so then I killed the scorpion. Unfortunately, that's part of the job sometimes. But what I did was I took the venom glands out and I looked to see what genes they had turned on. And what I found was they produce a vast array of venoms, like I said before. So these scorpions produce several types, and the major types they produce are these sodium alpha channel venoms, these are all specific for mammals. So these are all parts of your nervous system, and the way your nervous system works is on a sodium potassium pump. And so your nerve sends signals by flipping sodium potassium around along the length of a nerve. And so what happens is they actually block the reception of these channels. And so they block it in a few different ways. And so they have different venoms to block the reception in different ways. And so why would the ones in North America need more ways to block mammal sodium channels than scorpions living anywhere else? They're not eating the mammals, right? But it turns out the mammals are eating them. So here's one in particular. This one's called Centurides noxious because it's particularly venomous. And so it turns out, well, there is a reason. In North America, we have grasshopper mice, which are not in the Caribbean, and they're not in Central America for the most part. And grasshopper mice love to eat scorpions. Actually, sometimes they're called scorpion mice rather than grasshopper mice. And so they're nocturnally active rodents that prey specifically on scorpions. And I've actually seen some videos of Centurides like nailing these guys really hard in the face. And they just like blink and then like continue attacking the scorpions. And so they're pretty voracious. And so it turns out that somebody else was interested in this. And it wasn't just me. Surprise, surprise. It just took me longer to figure out that somebody else was interested in this. And another girl who was doing her PhD around the same time as me was actually looking specifically at this question. And what she did was she took grasshopper mice and scorpions that were living in the same region. So they were all living in the Chihuahuan Desert. And she took different populations. So she took like grasshopper mice from southern Chihuahuan Desert, which is in Mexico, and grasshopper mice from New Mexico in the US. And she took scorpions from those same places and she crossed them. So she injected venom into the grasshopper mice from Mexico and injected venom into the grasshopper mice from Mexico. And she found out that in fact the immune system of the mice responded differently. So if you took scorpions from that were found in the same place as the mouse, their immune system reacted really well to the venom. The venom didn't affect them at all. They just continued trying to kill the mice. Nothing happened. But if you took scorpions that were from a different place and injected into the mouse had an immune response that was much lower than the mice from the same place. So their immune system couldn't handle the venom of the different scorpion. So the scorpion from the different place had a greater effect on the mouse from a different place than the scorpion and the mouse from the same place. And so what that says is that there's basically an arms race going on between mice and scorpions. The mice are evolving resistant to the venom, and the scorpions are evolving new types of venom to counteract the mouse's resistance. And this just continues and continues and produces more and more complex types of venom in the scorpions. And probably a more complex immune system in the mice, although I'm not interested in that. And so what I did is, I took these venom glands from the scorpions, I milked them, and then I looked to see what they were producing and how much of it they were producing. And what it turns out is that in this one type of venom that acts specifically on sodium beta channels, which I'm really not an immunologist or a physiologist, so to me it doesn't mean a whole lot other than that it's one part of your nervous system. There's been a huge number of individual lineages that have duplicated. So like I said, a single scorpion could have 250 different venom types. So this isn't species of scorpions, it's actually types of venom in a single species. And so if we look through time, we find that there's been, at one point in time, which probably corresponds to when these scorpions have reached North America. So I guess the other thing I should tell you is one of the reasons I'm really interested in the Caribbean in particular is it seems to have sort of been like a birthplace of North American scorpions. So North American scorpions came from South America via the Caribbean to North America. So they didn't come up through Central America, they came up through the Caribbean, they made it to North America, they encountered these deadly mice that were killing them by thousands, and their venom started to change. And this shift in this graph, I hate showing graphs because they're kind of boring, but this shift in this graph is really remarkable and corresponds in fact exactly to when the scorpions entered North America and encountered North American grasshopper mice. So something else about scorpions that's really cool and makes me like them even more is that they fluoresce with ultraviolet light. So if you've never seen this, you should come on the night hike tomorrow. We're going to go look for scorpions with ultraviolet light. And so it's one of the properties of their exoskeleton that they have a pigment in their exoskeleton that fluoresces. And the function of this is almost unknown. There's a couple of good hypotheses about why they do this. One of the reasons is it's thought that because the moon gives off a lot of long wave light, which is like what UV light is a form of long wave light. It reflects long wave light really well, so things that are nocturnal can see better in UV than they can in sort of other colors. So for example, flowers, a lot of nocturnally flowering, actually some flowers during the day as well, have a UV pattern. So if you shine a UV light on a flower, you'll see there's often like a bullseye, like secret UV pigment on the flower. So it's not that a lot of insects and other nocturnally active things can see really well in UV. So then why would a scorpion want to fluoresce? Why would it want to be like really obvious at night to things that can see UV? Well, I think that there's probably two really likely scenarios. The first is that it's an attractant. So a lot of scorpions sit up on branches at night and they just sit there waiting for something to come by. And so if you're sitting on a branch of a plant and you fluoresce and you're curled up looking like a flower, you're probably going to attract some nocturnal animals. The other potential answer to this question is that it's what's called aposematic coloration. So a lot of things that are venomous, like wasps and bees, for example, have this black and yellow striping, and poison dart frogs are usually brightly colored. So a lot of things that are poisonous or venomous often have warning coloration to let you know. So if you're a nocturnal animal, like a grasshopper mouse that's eating scorpions, and you can see well in UV, and something's telling you like, hey, I'm venomous, I'm going to sting you, you might remember to stay away. I mentioned before that all arachnids have courtship. So this includes scorpions. And so the way scorpions court is they actually like face each other. The male will hold the female's hands in his hands, and they'll do sort of a pas de deux. They'll dance back and forth for several hours sometimes. Then he'll do something called cheliceraal massage, which is where he takes his chelicerae, which are right here, his mouth parts, and he like massages hers, which sort of looks like kissing. And then he has to like shudder in a particular way to coax her to dance with him. And at the end, if he's done the dance, if he's performed the dance properly, she'll allow him to deposit what's called a hemispermatophore, which is a package of sperm. So they don't actually copulate. He'll deposit a package of sperm on the ground, on a rock or something, and she'll allow him to coax her over the sperm, and she'll take the sperm into her body. And then she gets pregnant, and 9 months later, this is what happens. So here's a mama with some what's called first instar babies. And so after she gives birth, she forms what's called a birth basket. So she arches her back up and holds her hands into sort of a basket. And as the babies come out, they come out sort of in the middle of her body, underneath, right about here. They sort of drift downwards to her arms and then crawl up onto her back. And she carries them around for, depending on the species of scorpion and their lifespan, she'll carry them around from anywhere from a couple of weeks to several months, perhaps.
Scorpions don't lay eggs?
No, they don't. They all have a uterus.
Maybe it's just a rumor, but I always heard the male didn't make it out of that little dance.
No, it's a rumor. I mean, in some cases, if she's not receptive, and he's smaller, which is often the case. Like I said, scorpions will just eat just about anything. But if the male is successful courting, he almost always is totally fine. What are they feeding the babies? So you see these babies right here, they're really fat, and they sort of have like some egg yolk. They have some residual egg yolk. After they molt once, they'll actually look like tiny baby scorpions. They'll be the same color as the mom, the same shape as the mom. And at that point, they'll start eating. As she feeds, they'll eat like things that she drops. Or they'll just eat like, they'll get down and eat like little mats that are nearby and then hop back on. She doesn't really move a lot. She usually like hangs out in a burrow or something during this period.
The gestation period different for every size scorpion?
It's not necessarily based on size often, it's based on sort of what group of scorpions it belongs to. So some scorpions give birth to 2 babies and have a 6-month gestation period. Others give birth to 100 babies and have a 6-month gestation period. Others give birth to 10 and have a 1-month gestation period. It just depends. It's all sort of based on more on their evolutionary relationships than anything about size.
Since that came up about gestation period, did I hear you correctly that you said that about 20 new species of scorpion a year are emerging?
Are discovered by science. Yeah, sorry. Was somebody else raising their hand? No? The same things. Yeah, there's about 20 new species that are discovered to science every year. And actually that number is much larger, but there's not many scorpion biologists and we kind of have a backlog. So for the last few years, my job has really been, I'm a postdoctoral researcher on this big Caribbean biodiversity project, and my job is really as a field biologist. So I spend about 9 months of the year in the field collecting specimens, and in the case of scorpions, for those of you guys that are wondering what's going to happen tomorrow night, we go out with UV lights and sort of shuffle around. The UV lights aren't very bright, so you can't see the path super well. So we sort of shuffle around slowly, just scanning the trees and stuff. And if you have a good UV light, you can actually see scorpions from maybe 10 meters away with a UV light. And then you go over, take some really long forceps. I don't like getting stung, it's not really one of my hobbies. So I usually make sure I always have really long forceps. And then we collect them and we actually bring them back to the lab at that point. And once we're in the lab, almost all of the features, the characteristics that we use to identify species of arachnid are microscopic. So you really have to come back to a proper lab and look under a microscope to determine which species it belongs to or whether it's a new species to science. And at that point, we actually take them to the genetics lab. So for this project, we're working with the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. And we do all of our genetics at the Smithsonian, and we also deposit all of our specimens in the Smithsonian's collection. And so we bring them back to the lab, and we take a tiny piece of DNA, from the mitochondrial genome. So if you look at a cell of any animal, any living animal on Earth, they have little tiny things inside of their cells called organelles, ourselves included. And one of those organelles is called a mitochondria. And what's unique about the mitochondria is that it has its own DNA. So we have our DNA inside the nucleus, but the mitochondria has its own DNA as well. And the mitochondria is only inherited from the mother. So I have the same mitochondria as my mother, but my father has the mitochondria from my grandmother that I don't have. And what people have decided or discovered, maybe a combination of both, is that one of the genes in the mitochondrial genome evolves at the same rate that animals speciate. So that each species of animal has the same genetic sequence for that gene. Does that make sense? Yeah? So what we call it is actually a barcode. So it's a barcode, a species barcode. And so if you want to document the biodiversity of a given place, you first have to go out and collect the samples. Then you have to take them to an expert who determines what species they are. And then you can take them to the lab and barcode this, what's called CO1, cytochrome oxidase subunit 1, which is a really long name for the barcode gene. And then that barcode is unique to that species usually from that place. And so, well, this is what it looks like, or this is a model of it. We can't actually see what it looks like, so this is sort of the pipeline, right? We take it to the lab, we pull a piece of muscle tissue out of the leg of the spider, we amplify that for the single gene. So what we do is we basically take a genetic copy machine and we make thousands of copies of this one gene, and then we sequence them and look at what that sequence looks like. And what we can do in the end is we can compare the sequences, the barcode sequences, for different species on different islands. And we can figure out the relationship of the species on one island to the relation to the species on another island. So we can take St. Martin and Saba and Statia, and we can figure out, are the species of spider that are living on Saba more closely related to the species of spider on St. Martin, or more closely related to the species of spider on Statia? And so that's really interesting because it gives us sort of a window into how the biodiversity that came into this hotspot got here. Sort of what path did things take? Where are the spiders more closely related to? Did they come from North America? Did they come from South America? Did they come from Africa? Did they come from Central America? And the answer is actually a combination. They came from all over. But different species, or different groups of species, follow different trajectories. They follow different paths to reach to this place, and all come together to make this like ultra biodiverse region. And so that's sort of the ultimate goal of our project, to figure out where did things come from and how did they get here to make this place so tremendously biodiverse and unique. And so, well, here in the end, this is what it looks like. We build these things that sort of look like genealogies or trees of relationships between things. And so, in this case, actually, these are all spiders from Central America, or the scorpions from Central America. These are scorpions from North America. These are scorpions from a little tiny part of Central America called the Tortoise Block, which is Nicaragua and Honduras. And then right here in green, we have all the scorpions from this one group, the bark scorpions. All the scorpions from the Caribbean, and we can see that they all form a single family unit. They're all related to each other. So the bark scorpions living in the Caribbean are each other's closest relative. Their closest relative isn't in North America or South America or Central America. They're all each other's closest relative. But in fact, if you take all of the scorpions from the Caribbean as a whole, their closest relative is in this little tiny Tortoise Block, which is Nicaragua and Honduras. So, I don't, how much time have I been talking for? I don't want to keep you guys so long. 6:25. 6:25? Yeah, so this is, so in the final minutes, I actually just like wonder if people have some questions, but in the meantime, I was just going to show you some slides from some field trips in the Caribbean. This one in particular is from Cuba.
Could you go back a little bit and get more detail on why they have biodiversity in the past?
Sure. So in the case of I think in the case of many things, not just spiders and scorpions, in the case of many terrestrial animals, The reason that Saba is so biodiverse is a number of things. One, it's the elevation of the island and the steepness of it, which gives it a lot of different types of habitats that are not in an island of similar size that's not as high. The second reason is that its closest land-connected neighbor is the U.S. Virgin Islands, but its closest geographic neighbor is other islands that were not connected.
Lauren, when you were out with the comprehensive students today on a field trip, you found 2 new species of spiders. Could you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, sure. So actually I brought them with me. So if people want to come up and have a look at the end. A lot of the new species of spiders that we find are actually like tiny spiders because nobody's ever looked for them before. And often they live in the leaf litter, which means sort of the litter that's gathered from fallen leaves in the trees. And so a lot of times what I do is I look in leaf litter and I look under stones and stuff like that. And almost always we find new species that are unique to each island. They're completely new to science. Nobody's ever seen them before. And today, in about 5 minutes, I found 2 new species over by the sulfur mine trail, like in the first 10 meters of the trail. And one of them is a purple one. So it's rare that you recognize right away that you have a new species. Like they're so tiny, you don't know until you get back to the lab. But in some cases, you recognize it right away. So in the case today, there was a purple spider with really long legs, and that's really distinctive. I mean, a purple spider, right? And you'll see it's really purple. I'm not exaggerating it, but it's tiny, and it's a group of spiders called Ochirosiratids. And I know that there's no Ochirosiratids that have ever been discovered on Saba, and so I knew right away that that's a new species of science. Another thing I should say about Ochirosiratids is they're so tiny that they tend to be what we call single island endemics, which means that each island, if it has a species, that species is unique only to that island, isn't found anywhere else in the world. And in some islands, there's multiple single island endemics, so they might have 5 species that are unique only to that island. And that's actually the case in the second species that I found this morning, which is another tiny spider called the goblin spider. I'm not totally 100% sure because there are some goblin spiders known, but this actually happens to be a really big goblin spider, which in this case means like 1 millimeter or something. And big enough that I could actually see it running around on the bottom of a rock, and so I'm pretty sure that it's probably another new species. Yeah.
Are there other arachnids that reflect UV light?
There are
Like
not.
nocturnal spiders? No.
No. So scorpions are the only arachnid. They're actually one of the only animals that fluoresces. So reflectance and fluorescence are slightly different. Reflectance just means that whatever wavelength you shine at something, it shines the exact wavelength back.
But you know you got scorpions.
But fluorescence, actually the wavelength is excited and shined back as a different color. So scorpions fluoresce. So it's not UV light coming back, it's actually within the visible
It's
spectrum.
their own light.
And they're the only ones. There are some millipedes that fluoresce. And silverfish? Jelly, yeah, there's some, I was just thinking about land stuff, but yeah, there's a bunch of ocean dwelling animals that fluoresce. Okay.
I was wondering about the process of the venom. You're saying that he can create over 200 different kinds of venom, and he attacks different part of the system of the prey. How does the process go? Do they catch the prey and then figure out what they need to do and what is going to attack, or?
Yeah, that's a good question. So actually, they just produce all the venoms.
On the spot? I mean, how
they have all the venoms and they store them. So it turns out, we've done some experiments, and it turns out that the peak venom production, after they use all their venom that they have stored, so they store venom, but once they've used it all up, it takes 48 hours before they produce the peak amount of venom again. And so during this time, I mean, if you think about it, normally if somebody kills a big fat cricket and they have a huge meal, it's going to be at least 48 hours before they need to eat again. So it's not really necessary that the scorpions are able to reproduce venom extremely quickly. And the thing about which venoms do they use, they just make all of them. And there has been some evidence in venomous snakes that also make a bunch of different types of venom, that they can choose which venoms they're using somehow. But there's not been any evidence yet for that in scorpions, although it could very well be the case. And as far as snakes go, I don't think they have any clue how they select which venoms they're using when they envenomate. But there is some evidence that they can choose.
And none of it is actually deadly to human beings.
None of the ones in the Caribbean.
That's good enough as an answer.
That we know of.
No, definitely. None of them are lethal. Oh, and I guess I didn't say, I never got to it maybe. So some of the venoms actually are being used